MSW Media.
Spy Talk, a podcast at the intersection of intelligence, foreign policy, national security, and military operations.
Hi there, I'm Michael Isikoff, and this is Spy Talk. I was now closer to the center of the prison, and I could hear just about everything, the screams, the crying, right down to the sound of blows landing on my terrified fellow prisoners in the adjacent cells. The next morning, I heard the start of terrifying brutality being systematically carried out in this central part of the dungeon as guards worked their way down the hall toward me, opening each door, beating the hell out of each inmate, and then slamming the door as they left. I don't think I knew what fear was until I heard a grown man screaming for his life. So writes Sam Goodwin about his harrowing ordeal as a prisoner in one of Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad's torture chambers. It is an extraordinary story of a young American from St. Louis who embarked on a personal adventure to visit every country in the planet, only to be ensnared when he made it into Syria by Assad's security forces, who threw him into one of their most notorious prisons as a suspected CIA spy. His account, told in his new book called Saving Sam, the true story of an American's disappearance in Syria and his family's extraordinary fight to bring him home, is a reminder of the still ongoing atrocities in Syria's 13-year-long civil war. A conflict that has cost the lives of more than 500,000 Syrians and displaced an astounding 13 million Syrians, more than 5 million of them refugees. A humanitarian disaster right next door to the war between Israel and Hamas, yet today virtually ignored by the international media. We'll talk to Goodwin about his time in Assad's prisons and the equally remarkable story of how he made it out, thanks to the clandestine intervention of another country's spy chief, on this episode of Spy Talk. Sam Goodwin, welcome to Spy Talk.
Mike, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Sure enough. And what an amazing story you tell, and one that has all sorts of implications for hostage taking and the state of the Mideast. So let's just start out and tell us a bit about yourself. You're a young man in your 20s. You were an accomplished hockey player, and you set out to see the world. Why do you do it, and how do you end up in Syria?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. So I'm originally from and grew up in St. Louis, Missouri, and played hockey most of my life, as you mentioned. And after college, I had an opportunity to move to Singapore. And from 2010 to 2020, in those 10 years, of much of which I spent living and working overseas, 6 in Singapore and 1 in Dubai, I had a journey to travel to every country in the world, and I did do it. But like any worthwhile venture or endeavor in life, it wasn't without its challenges. And perhaps most notably, in the spring of 2019, I had traveled to 180 of 193 countries in the world.
So you're towards the end of your quest to see every country on the planet.
Very much to the end. I had 12 to go. And I'll just mention this journey started very organically for me. Travel for me when I moved to Southeast Asia was something that I did on weekends and holidays and when I had an opportunity away from work. And it was never originally about ticking boxes or checking places off a list. Travel was always about learning. Travel's the best education I've ever had. And from there, it evolved organically into this goal. And in May of 2019, I had been to 180 of 193 countries. And on May 25th, I went to Syria. And just 2 hours after arriving, I was walking through a roundabout on the way to meet up with my guide when all of a sudden this black pickup truck abruptly pulled up next to me. 2 armed men jumped out of the back seat and instructed me to get inside. And thankfully they weren't violent, but I didn't have a choice. And as we sped down back alleys of the city, the officers in the vehicle accused me of espionage, of being an American spy and collaborating with terrorists. And nothing like this had ever happened to me before.
Do you think they knew that you were there, that somebody had tipped them off that this American traveler had crossed the border in northeast Syria from Iraq? Do you think somebody had tipped them off to this?
I don't know for sure, but there is a little bit of information that that suggests that that could have been possible. That the Northeast is a disputed area, of course, controlled primarily by the Kurds over the past several years, and there could have been something like that. It also could have been wrong place, wrong time. It could have been my travel history. I had traveled to these other places, so maybe the stamps in my passport. I don't actually know exactly why that happened.
When you crossed into Syria, did you go through a border crossing? You showed your passport and have it stamped?
Yep. So I crossed at Faish-Kibor, and on the Iraq side, I had my passport. I went into an office. I had my passport stamped. I went across the river into an office on the Syrian side, and also had my passport stamped as well, and then proceeded there from the border to Kamishli. So it was a very straightforward entry process.
And when was it?
This was on May 25th, 2019.
Okay. So 2019, and the Syrian civil war has been going on for quite some time, at least, 8 years by then?
Yeah, roughly eight years. And in the Northeast, it was calmer, but and things had dialed down a little bit, but still there were remnants of it.
So here's where your story gets even more hairy, because you get taken to a notorious Syrian prison, Branch 215. Tell us about Branch 215.
So actually from Kamishli, I was put in the cargo hold of a Syrian military plane and flown from Kamishli to Damascus. And when we landed in what I learned to be Damascus, the Syrian capital city, I was taken from the airport, driven into the center of town, and taken into the basement of a facility, as you mentioned, called Syria's Military Intelligence Prison number 215, a facility notoriously known for housing political prisoners. And I'll never forget the officer in charge. He spoke a little bit of English, and he escorted me to a cell in the back of the basement. And when he put me in there, he went to the inside of the cell door and he said, food, water, toilet, knock. But otherwise, he said, quiet, no talking. And he slammed the door and left. And I went on to remain here in solitary confinement for 27 days. The only human interaction I had was for a few seconds in the morning and evening when the guards brought bread and boiled potatoes and water.
Now, I have to say, I have particular interest in this story, and it's one that the people in the West should hear, because it is at this prison, Assad's prison, Branch 215, that the Caesar photos were taken. And for those who don't know the story, the Caesar photos are named for a Syrian security guard, codenamed Caesar, who smuggled these photos out of the prison into the West, smuggled them, I think, in his shoe. Those photos are some of the most harrowing pictures I've ever seen. It's rows and rows of emaciated, brutalized, tortured prisoners stacked up one against the other, images eerily reminiscent of the Nazi Holocaust. And as you describe in your book, you are sitting in solitary in this cell, and you hear the screaming of the prisoners who are being tortured in adjacent cells.
During my time in Branch 215, I was, thank God, never physically harmed, but the facility, as you mentioned, was not soundproof. And every day I would hear the sounds of inmates in neighboring cells screaming from being beaten and tortured. In fact, there was a specific man who was responsible for this. And I would hear him go down the hall of the cell, opening up each door and beating the inmates who were in the cell. And then he would come to my door, and then I recap this in the book. He'd come to my door, he would open it and just kind of look at me, and then he would take a second and then turn around and leave, and then the torture would continue in the cell next to me. And I don't know exactly why I was treated that way, potentially because of my passport. But as you mentioned, this facility is notorious for torture by Assad's forces, and the Caesar photos, many of them are believed to have been taken in this facility. And I'll just mention, I in 2021 I did my master's at WashU in St. Louis, where we're both alums, and I wrote my thesis on the conflict in Syria, and I referenced one of the stories that you have about interviewing Assad and kind of pressing him on these photos specifically, and him essentially kind of denying them. But they did happen in this facility that I was in. This is a facility that is designed for some of the worst, quote unquote, the worst criminals or whoever's accused of that in the world. And I was in it.
But it's really political prisoners who predominate in that facility. And I have to say, I started writing about these photos, before you were detained for several years, because, they kind of dribbled out, did not get nearly the kind of public attention that they should have. But I remember interviewing the late Senator John McCain about these, because he was very much a advocate of doing everything we could to defeat Bashar al-Assad and overthrow his regime. And he said he would tell me how he would keep copies of these photos on his desk and look at them every day as a reminder of Assad's brutality. And of course, when I went in 2017 to interview Assad, I took with me some of those photos, knowing that when you ask him about stuff like this, about the excesses of his regime, he would always come back and say, because I'd watched earlier interviews, "Do you have the evidence? Show me the evidence." And that's exactly what he said in my interview. And I had in my sports coat lapel some of those photos, which I handed it to him. He immediately pushed back and said, "Well, these are just photos. You have no idea if they're authentic. How can we trust them? Fake news." And then I also had with me an FBI report, because the FBI crime lab had analyzed these
authenticated them
and determined that they were.
And also the lights went out too.
Well, yes. When I first handed Assad the photos in an interview that was being taped by Syrian TV, because they wouldn't let us take our own cameras in, the lights immediately went out as they processed how they were going to respond.
Yeah. What's heartbreaking for me about this is after 215, I was moved to a facility called Adra, and I met lots of other Syrian inmates. And they told me about their stories in these security branches, like Branch 215 and Sednaya and others. And they showed me the scars on their bodies. They told me the stories of the torture and their loved ones who had been killed, their friends who had been killed. And these were stories that I'm not making up. They were right in front of me. I learned about these firsthand. They told me their stories. I'm still connected with them today, and it's heartbreaking to experience what's happening there, because one of the most important things I learned in all my travels is that some of the best hospitality I've ever experienced is across the Middle East. And I know that if I wouldn't have had this experience in Syria, I would have experienced incredible hospitality, as I did everywhere else. And these men were fantastic people who had been through heartbreaking situations. And one last thing I'll say is that I'll never forget, in this second month, I was talking to one of the other inmates who had become kind of a friend. And I said to him, "Hey, everybody here is being so nice to me. It's kind of hard to know what to expect in a situation like this." And he responded, he said, "Sam, in Syria, all the good people are here in prison because all the bad people are outside putting us in here."
Now we'll take a quick break and be back in a moment. And we're back. Just to underscore the point, the reason the Syrian regime is doing this, the reason so many people, including yourself, were thrown into this branch 215 is because of the crackdown that Assad has launched in response to the civil war over the excesses, triggered by the excesses of his regime.
Yeah, absolutely. When the Arab Spring reached Syria in 2010, 2011, peaceful demonstrations, bare chests were met with bullets, which escalated into a widespread civil war. But it was essentially Assad cracking down on peaceful demonstrators. And many of the people who I met told me their stories, and they were all the same stories. They were all the same stories of these politically motivated crimes and how they ended up in those situations.
So you're in the branch 215 for 27 days in 2019. Then you're transferred to another prison and still held incommunicado, still unable to communicate with your family. But your family is doing quite a bit back in St. Louis to try to get you out. And that's the second part of this story that is, super important and interesting. Tell us about who your family was in touch with from the FBI and the White House and the fusion cell that had been created to try to bring unlawfully detained Americans, such as yourself, back home.
The news of my disappearance was essentially learned through me going dark. I was always very good about keeping in touch, especially if I was in more of an unstable place. And I had communicated that I was going to be in Syria for just a few days. And when that time passed and people weren't hearing from me, they began to worry. And my father works in civil engineering. My mother's a registered nurse turned educator. Both of them are smart people and have had relative success in their respective fields, but they're an average family from Middle America. They had no idea what to do when their son went missing in the Middle East. But thankfully, they began to act and they reached the FBI field office in St. Louis, which pretty quickly escalated to some of the highest levels of the U.S. government in Washington, including the fusion cell, as you mentioned. But throughout my captivity, my family had kind of this roller coaster experience with the U.S. government. But early on, the government communicated two key things to my family. The first, they said, we strongly recommend that you keep this out of the news, keep all of the communication very tight. Don't let the press get a hold of this, because if they do, and Sam's captors, depending on who they are, which was actually still kind of unknown at the time, feel that type of pressure, they might just kill him.
And is this the FBI telling this to your parents?
Working primarily with the Hostage Recovery Fusion Cell, which is based at FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C. Also working with the SPIHA office, the Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs, based at the State Department, which at the time was Ambassador Robert O'Brien, who was incredibly helpful to my family, as well as some others like Luke Hardig and David Bradley and others who work on these cases. The second thing they said to my family, though, was, and this is detailed in the book, they say you should really manage your expectations, because we have no diplomatic or economic ties with Syria. There may not be a whole lot we can do here to help. About 3 weeks later, my younger sister, Stephanie, who was 25 years old at the time, living in Nashville, she particularly became entirely overwhelmed with everything that was happening. And she decided that she needed to just call someone and talk to them about this, which was against the recommendation of the U.S. government of keeping all of the communication very tight. So she decided that she's going to call her former college roommate, who is actually coincidentally also named Stephanie. So there's this phone call between the Stephanies, and as the story goes, it's like, hey, how you doing? And my Steph says, well, actually, things aren't very good. And she goes on to explain that my brother's been missing for weeks and nobody's heard from him. And we're working with all of these agencies and officials. Nobody's been able to help. We're really scared. And roommate Steph is, of course, shocked to hear something like this, but says all the right things and offers her full support. And at the end of the call, as the story goes, roommate Steph says, hey, if there's anything I can do, just let me know. And my Steph responded almost jokingly or sarcastically, she said, unless you know someone who knows Assad, the Syrian president, please just pray. And roommate Steph, kind of a light bulb went off, and she said, well, wait, let me call you back. And it turned out that roommate Steph is Lebanese, and her uncle is good friends with General Abbas Ibrahim, who heads Lebanon's internal security. And General Ibrahim was able to work with his counterpart in Damascus, primarily General Ali Mamluk, to negotiate with the Syrians and mediate my release.
So this is pretty amazing. And talk about coincidences and unexpected connections. Your sister's college roommate had an uncle who was friends with the head of Lebanese intelligence.
Exactly.
And somehow the uncle gets what's his name? Abbas Ibrahim, who was then the head of Lebanese intelligence, interested in trying to get you out. Why? I'm just like, why? Why do you think this appeal to the head of a foreign country's intelligence service, it fell on receptive ears?
So Stephanie, roommate Steph's uncle, his name's Joseph, and he and Abbas Ibrahim were actually also roommates in the Lebanese military academy when they were young cadets. And since that time, their careers had gone in different directions. Abbas had stayed in the Lebanese government. Joseph had moved to the United States and is a businessman here in the U.S. now. But they remained in touch. And essentially, this request from Joseph to the general came as a request of family, as a personal request. And what I've been told is that if the request to Abbas would have come through a more diplomatic or official channel, it may have been received differently. So it's reasonable to say that Abbas Ibrahim acted the way he did because his friend had asked him to for a favor.
Everything is personal, especially in the Mideast.
Right? Especially in the Middle East. Exactly.
Right. Exactly. So Ibrahim, the Lebanese intelligence chief, reaches out to his Syrian counterpart in Bashar Assad's government, the chief of Syrian intelligence, and says, I'd like you to release this American Sam Goodwin.
I'll tell you a quick story that's actually not in the book, and I've heard this later, but essentially Abbas, after getting the call from Joseph, reached out to Ali Mamluk and said, hey, can we go to lunch? And Mamluk says, okay, sounds good. So Abbas goes to Damascus and they have lunch together. They talk about a range of things. And at the end of the lunch, Abbas says, hey, there's this guy, Sam Goodwin. And Ali Mamluk says, I don't know who that is, but I'll look into it and I'll let you know. So Abbas goes back to Lebanon, and a couple days later, Mamluk calls Abbas and says, hey, you know that lunch we had? Let's do it again. So Abbas says, okay. So he goes back to Damascus. They have another lunch. They talk about a range of things. And at the end of the lunch, Mamluk says, hey, you know that Sam Goodwin guy that you talked about? Well, we have him, but the president hasn't decided yet what he wants to do with him. So Abbas says, okay, well, I would like to have him, so let me know. So he goes back to Beirut, and a few days later, Mamluk got in touch with Abbas and said, we've decided that we're going to release him to you.
And don't you write in there that Assad himself was in the adjoining room listening to this conversation?
Another memorable part of this that we learned later was that my family had been working on all of these different paths. They had been working with the government. There was the Lebanese connection. They'd worked with the Catholic Church. They had even connected with the Russians and NGOs and the patriarch of the Eastern Orthodox Church, these different paths. And allegedly there was this conversation where I was in Assad's office. I was being characterized as essentially a nobody. Like a boss was saying, "Hey, listen, he's a nobody. He's not a spy. He's just a traveler. Just give me Sam. Take him back." And apparently, Assad essentially poked his head into the room and said, "Well, considering he's a nobody, the U.S. government wants him, the Vatican wants him, the Lebanese want him, the Russians want him, and the Patriarch wants him. It sounds like quite a nobody to me." And so this was kind of this stunning revelation, because my family had been working on all of these different paths, not knowing if any of them had actually reached where they wanted it to. And it turns out, again, apparently, that many of these people had actually gone to bat and tried to intervene. So there were actually multiple paths from this ordinary family in St. Louis to a head of state in the Middle East.
So there's another American detainee still believed to be in Syria, Austin Tice, a journalist. And I was struck by the fact that you asked about him on a number of occasions. If any of your fellow prisoners had seen him or were aware of them, you came up empty. But how do you think about the fact that your family was able to make a connection that sprung you from Assad's prisons, but Austin Tice is still unknown? His whereabouts and his condition are unknown to this day.
Yeah, my heart breaks for Austin and Deborah and Mark and the entire family and everyone who's worked on the case. As you mentioned, since I've been home, I've tried to use the connections that I made in that second month with the other inmates and try to backtrack their path to see if any of the information they have could lead to information about Austin. And as you mentioned, I've come up empty on that, and I don't know. I don't have anything to offer. But as I mentioned, my heart breaks. There's information that suggests that he was at some point also held in 215. Branch 215, where I was for a month. And so for me, it just put so much into perspective, and I'm so grateful. And I realize that oftentimes these cases don't end the way that mine did. And so I'm committed to doing whatever I can to help others, whether they're detained in Syria or any country around the world. There's this community of people that for every one of those hostages and wrongful detainees, there's also a family that's going the hardest thing that they've ever gone through in their life, something that nothing can prepare them for. So try to use, I'll say, Mike, I don't feel so much survivor's guilt as I feel what I would characterize as survivor's responsibility. And I'm trying to use what I learned, my connections, to try to help others.
So on that note, two sort of bottom line takeaways from your story. First, what it tells us and what message you have for what is fast becoming a burgeoning population of unlawfully detained Americans overseas, in Russia, in Iran, in Syria, obviously. More and more time again, hostile regimes are seizing American citizens and holding them, sometimes for ransom, sometimes for a swap, as in Putin's Russia, sometimes, as with Austin Tice, just holding them.
Yeah, and it's heartbreaking. I've tried to do what I can, and if someone said it to me the other day, another former hostage said, we're part of the most elite club that nobody wants to be a part of. And frankly, this club that I didn't even know existed, but it's become they're a very dynamic and caring and innovative group of people. And they've become a part of my life in a way that I could have never expected. And we try to work together and support each other as best we can.
Finally, and perhaps most importantly of all, the Syrian civil war. Over 500,000 people have been killed in this conflict. 5 million or more refugees, which, by the way, is more than 5 times the total number of refugees Palestinian refugees from the 1948 Israel war, right? And we are still living with that today, obviously very much in the headlines. Yet the magnitude of the Syrian refugee crisis is more than 5 times that which happened to the Palestinians. And here's this horrific war. The Russians are bombing. ISIS is there. American-backed forces are there. Turkish-backed forces are there. Assad's brutality continues. This horrendous humanitarian disaster in the middle of the Middle East, right next door to the one we've all been preoccupied with about the war in Gaza. Yet in Syria, it's almost ignored by the international press at this point.
Yeah, arguably the most tragic humanitarian disaster of our lifetime by conservative estimates. 500,000 people have died in the conflict. The UN stopped counting at 250,000. And I think the Assad regime has capitalized on the international community's indifference and inaction on this issue. And I think what I think a lot about is kind of what I was saying a few minutes ago, just about how the Syrian people, through this, nobody suffered more than the Syrian people. And these people are some of the warmest and most just welcoming and incredible people that I've ever met. And the people in Syria and all of these conflicts need a lot of prayers. And I hope that there's meaningful progress that's in the near future.
Well, we can all hope, of course. But in the meantime, I want to thank you, Sam. The book is Saving Sam, the true story of an American's disappearance in Syria and his family's extraordinary fight to bring him home. It's out this week. Sam, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks, Mike.
And that's it for this week's Spy Talk. Be sure to check out our complete podcast archive on Apple or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you haven't already, do check out the spytalk.com news site on Substack, where we offer a steady diet of scoops and original analyses on the intersection of intelligence, foreign policy, and military operations. Just Google Spy Talk and you'll quickly find your way there. This edition of the Spy Talk podcast was smoothly produced, as always, by Kanai and expertly edited by Molly Hawkey for MSW Media. That's it. See you around. I'm Michael Isikoff. Thanks for listening.
For more original reporting and insights like this, subscribe to spytalk.co on Substack and follow us on Twitter at @talk_spy. If you enjoyed our podcast, subscribe and leave a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
MSW Media.